All right. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Yaron.
So today we're going to talk about learning and the relationship between ingenuism and learning, kind of the mechanism by which we learn and how kind of feedback, positive and negative feedback, can help in the learning process. So what kind of environment facilitates learning?
Well, you need three things for learning to really create the momentum that is possible in ingenuism. You need to have a commitment to getting feedback, because feedback doesn't automatically flow to you. In some circumstances it does, but you have to be committed to getting feedback, so you have some structure for that. And then you have to have the right incentives to evaluate that feedback in an unobjective way. You're not going to always like it. And as human beings, we tend to focus on where we're doing well and not where we're doing poorly. And that makes it a challenge to both create the structure for feedback, because you don't want to get negative feedback, but that's, of course, where you learn. You don't learn very much from your successes. But you can learn a lot from your failures. And then finally, you need to take action on what you evaluate out of the feedback. If you learn something, but you don't actually do anything with that knowledge, then it doesn't feedback. It doesn't cycle back into whatever you're trying to accomplish.
So what do you mean by a structure? So is this within organization, as an individual, as a society? What does structure look like for each one of those?
Well, it's something that puts the feedback in front of your face, whether you want it or not. So it's something that automates the data or the information that comes back from whatever you're trying to do. Let's say we're trying to have more people listening to our podcast. Mm-hmm. Then we would need to have an idea of how many people were listening to the podcast, why they were listening to the podcast, and how to reach people who would be interested in the podcast. And you could guess about those kind of things, but you'd never be successful on doing that if you weren't receiving feedback on who's listening, how many people are listening, and get some sense of why they're listening.
Yeah, and how that changes over time. And that feedback can be, one, the numbers, but the feedback can also be comments from people, surveys, asking people why they listen, what they like, what they don't like, things like that. So it could be a wide variety of different signals.
Absolutely. And there's probably a bunch of signals that we've never thought about, because we're not that committed to growing the audience of the podcast.
To learning.
Yeah. We're committed to learning about learning, but not learning how to do things. No, in all seriousness, it's a learning process. So it's this weird nested, like a layered onion, where feedback isn't some structure that you can go and read a book and say, oh, that's how you do it. Mm-hmm. Feedback is exploring and discovering different ways that you can learn more about how effective you're being, and then taking action to try new things that incorporate what you've learned, but don't treat it like, no, okay, now I found the answer, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life.
Yep. And it seems like individuals tend to try to evade feedback or try to evade negativity, generally negativity about themselves. They're very good. We talked about this before the show, very good at negativity about others and negativity about the world and the culture and everything else. But people tend to be very, very resistant to getting feedback, to accepting the idea that things could be better and that they have control over making them better. People get insulted, people get offended. To what extent do you think that hampers ingenuous thinking in individuals and hampers people's ability to live good lives?
Well, it definitely hampers individuals, but to a very different degree, because and over the course of your lifetime, you probably have periods where you're really receptive to feedback and eager to learn. And in certain areas of your life, you'll be receptive to feedback and eager to learn, while in other times and in other areas, you're not. But that's within a fairly simple set of controls. Like we have a lot of say over how we are in our lives.
Yep.
But when we start getting together in groups, it gets really complicated, because if you think about, say, a startup company, startup companies tend to be pretty good at taking feedback. They get very immediate feedback because they're always approaching customers, and the customers are always saying no. If they can't take the no as an answer, then they drop out of the business very quickly. So it selects for people who are willing to take feedback. The VCs are telling them no, you're not getting, we're not going to give you money, or VCs are not telling them yes and stringing them along. There's a lot of negativity, except for most entrepreneurs, for Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, that negativity isn't soul crushing. Whereas it might be if it was, a series of men saying no to go out on dates. So when you get into an organization, depending on what the organization's core incentives are, then it can be fairly easy and kind of in your control, or you start to lose that. And at the other extreme, you would look at something like, public health in the world, but we'll focus on the United States. In most places in the world, and certainly in the United States, did a pretty lousy job managing the response to COVID. There were some areas where things went really well. Vaccines were developed very quickly. They were very effective. Public health's contribution to that was pretty minimal money. And then, of course, at the end, it was all the regulators slowing down the production and distribution of these vaccines. So that itself would be a good area to look at. But then you go and look at all the other areas relating to restrictions, shutdowns, schools, testing, all the things that were blown. And it is an opportunity. We haven't had a pandemic in any of our lifetimes until now. So it's eminently forgivable, even though there were plans and that in the moment that people would screw up. And so I don't have any problem with the mistakes that were made. It's easy to look back and say, oh, it should have been done differently. And even at the time, I thought things should be done differently. But it's one data point. What is infuriating is the fact that now there doesn't seem to be any lessons learned. And that's because there isn't a structure for taking feedback. There isn't a desire to look at it objectively, and there's no commitment to taking action. In fact, it's almost the opposite, where the people that public health that screwed everything up is now writing the narrative about what happened in COVID and what should happen in the next pandemic. And of course, that narrative is intended to make them look good. And if you're trying to look good, you're not looking for feedback.
And it's one of the reasons I think we have a strong preference for market solutions over bureaucratic government solutions is exactly this. Markets tend to provide feedback. They provide feedback through prices, through demand, through supply, through, CEOs do badly. People think CEOs make a lot of money and they're there for life. But it turns out CEOs most CEOs don't last very long. They get kicked out, they get fired. Employees get fired when they do a bad job. Indeed, I think the public health officials right now, if they were working in a private sector and it screwed up as badly as they did, they would have been fired. They would have been, the organization would have figured out an alternative. So the marketplace is this amazing place where this kind of feedback and the self-correction happens. Otherwise, you don't survive.
Yeah, it gets forced on you. And when it's continuously being forced on you, just like, you have to ask 100 VCs to get one to say yes. And then you realize that all you need is one to say yes, then you get used to taking the feedback. And if you aren't in that position, if you're not forced to, human nature is, I don't really want to know where I feel. And in some areas of life that it's never going to contribute to you living a great life. But in some areas, it's fairly low cost. But in other areas, especially when you're impacting the opportunities for millions of other people, it's a huge cost. And it's completely unacceptable. If there's anything that we can recognize in the 21st century that has given us the world that we live in, as opposed to, scratching sticks in a cave, is that it's been learning. And learning is part of a process that involves feedback. And we haven't had a great showing, I would say, over the last couple of years.
Well, I'm not convinced I'm pretty convinced that the areas in which have been centralized and being bureaucratized, we have a long track record of not getting feedback. I mean, we both done a lot of research on banking and financial regulation. I mean, when have they ever learned there? I mean, we could go back to 1933 and say there's very little being learned from the many bank crises from before or after then, and they seem to pile up and create new crises every time that are completely predictable, and that people can see them, but they refuse to take the feedback because they refuse to challenge their own authority. And again, I return to the beauty, in a sense, of markets is that you can't get away with that, not for very long. Sure, there's an end run once in a while where they don't want to learn from their mistakes and they stick their head in the sand and they pretend like, or they're committing fraud. But many of these companies, they're just pretending like reality is different than it really is. But then they go bust, and we move on from those guys. There's that reward mechanism that rewards reality orientation and the learning process.
Yes. And if you were to look at the companies that have been the most successful in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it's companies who have adapted and taken the feedback. Even companies that, and you could argue that, Google stumbled into this magical tool that improved all of our lives, actually being able to search the internet and find what you want to. And they figured out how to do it. And then it was easy rate, it was easy money after that. Mm-hmm. And that's just not true. Yeah. The ability to continuously get feedback, to learn from that feedback, and then to evolve how you do things is behind every single successful company, every single successful person, every single successful organization that is on the planet. There is no substitute for learning, and you can't learn if you're not looking for your mistakes, acknowledging your mistakes, and then taking action based on what you learned.
And maybe Amazon is one of the great examples of that. I mean, they have this ability to try a lot of different things and figure out what doesn't work and accept it and move on, or change or adapt, but not to repeat, right? Not to repeat the same mistake over and over again. I mean, Amazon phone. I mean, how many products has Amazon launched and then killed almost immediately once they realized the feedback was negative?
Yes, and that's a big part of, if you're a company, but it's also as an individual, mm-hmm. is when you get feedback, sometimes the appropriate response is say, I'm not going to do that anymore. Yep. And that's something that is really hard to do, especially when doing that is tied to your career, your identity, to who you see yourself as being. But that's all made up. Like, that's all something that we impose upon ourselves. And so the risk of taking feedback that people see, the risk of acknowledging mistakes, sometimes it's built into the organization, but even in organizations like Amazon or like Netflix, where there's a stated, everyone has permission to make mistakes as long as you learn from them. And there's actually a formal structure for how you're going to acknowledge mistakes, how you're going to share what you learned, because you learning the lesson is maybe not that valuable relative to whatever the cost of the mistake is. But if thousands or tens of thousands of people in the organization learn that lesson, then it could actually be the mistake was extremely profitable for the company as a whole on a going forward basis. That kind of environment really supports people, but it's still difficult. It doesn't work for everyone. And a lot of times it only happens because the people at the top are extremely transparent about saying, oh yeah, I screwed up, and here's what I've learned, and here's what we're going to do differently going forward.
Mhm. It requires a real commitment. It requires a commitment throughout management. And as you said, it has to be structurally somehow built in. And it has to be repeated where people get a confidence that, yes, this is being done consistently. They're not just after me. It's not just my project, but this is it's a culture. And I think that's true in the culture. And it's harder to do in the culture because that requires the kind of feedback mechanisms that maybe are not formalized. But in a company, you can formalize that, and you can structure it in a way where you can make it a part of life.
And you have the right incentives, but I think we all have the right incentives if we really look. It's
as
just
individuals, yes.
It's the challenge is to make sure that you recognize that the long-term benefit of seeking out feedback and accepting your mistakes and learning from them vastly outweighs whatever short-term discomfort. It's not like the mistakes aren't there just because you're refusing to learn from them. Public health screwed up in the pandemic, and that doesn't change at all whether they acknowledge them or not. It's a commitment to having that better world in the future. And in companies, there's a huge reward for that. You end up with $1 trillion market cap if you're Amazon. Unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, and public health would be a good example, there's no penalty for failure, but there's also no explicit reward for
success,
building that feedback mechanism and actually improving things down the road. And it's unfortunate because a lot of our world is not in a market feedback environment. Most of the political system, a lot of the healthcare system, most of the education system, some really big pieces of the world that matter a lot don't have that kind of feedback, but you could still have that type of organization, and you still do get it. The FAA helped create the zero crash world that we live in for commercial aircraft. There hasn't been a fatal crash in the US of a commercial airline for decades. And so how does that happen? Well, it happened in a large part because the FAA was willing to get behind the kind of information sharing and feedback collecting and incentive building, creating that structure, and then demanding that structure be implemented to learn lessons and change things, improve things going forward. You wouldn't have guessed that the FAA would do that. But they did. And so there's absolutely no reason that the CDC couldn't do that. It's not impossible. It just takes someone whose commitment goes beyond, whatever their stock options might be worth. And it's not as reliable, but if we could figure out a way, if we could discover a way for the feedback mechanism to start being embedded as a formal structure and in a part of the culture in these areas where it's largely lacking, it would be huge. I mean, we know that medical errors lead to thousands, if not tens of thousands of deaths every year. So the planes are crashing every day. And there isn't yet across the system a way to learn from those mistakes and to reduce them and to, with the goal of it never happening again. And if you really think about it, it should be unacceptable that people are dying from errors. And I don't mean that we should be punishing people, because that's the exact opposite of what you want in an effective feedback system. As soon as you start punishing people, then people start hiding their errors, and you've destroyed the feedback mechanism. But there's to not have the entire focus of public health being on how to improve things like pandemic response or medical errors, it just boggles the mind. And if you were to ask any individual in public health, I would imagine that they actually do care about public health. but it's the system, it is just needs a catalyst to where people see that if they care, this is what they need to do.
It's surprising that hospitals and some doctor practices haven't created these kind of feedback mechanisms. Maybe some have. Would be interested if there was rankings of hospital based on this, because you'd expect there'd be some differences in these organizations in terms of the level of errors made. And you'd think somebody would have built a kind of a feedback system.
People are definitely working on it at individual hospitals. Unfortunately, if you implement this in a hospital, then you start acknowledging your errors, and you appear to have more errors than the hospitals that are hiding their errors. And so even though your true error level might be high, lower and falling, it looks higher and falling. And so it's a thorny problem, and it would take a lot of experimentation. And medicine is not really excited about experimenting on things that could look worse before they look better. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. And if you think about the long-term trajectory, it'll make a little bit of difference this year. It'll make a little bit of difference next year. It'll make a little bit, but it would compound to where it make a huge difference in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. And that's what progress is really about. And learning is what drives it. So if you impede learning, you don't get it.